The history that was stolen from the Africans is not a small one. But it was not just taken from the Africans. It was taken from the Melanesians, Polynesians, Native Americans, and everybody else who had contributed greatly to the history of the world. And why was this done? For simple reasons: discrimination of the highest degree and colonization. This illness that is harbored within a population that deems itself higher than anybody else made them blind to things that they once saw, wrote about, and declared that their supremacy was a myth. Here we will discuss the several populations that had done things that amazed Europeans at the time. The boats that traveled from Europe and ended up in places like Africa and Asia and Southeast Asia and even the Americas, they did not have this pre-built idea that they should pretend like they discovered everything. And so, even in their own writings, we find them giving credit to the people who came before them. A good example of this is Vasco da Gama, who talks about three different people located in Mozambique, East Africa. As you can see, he mentions Moors in the first sentence. The Moors had constructed palisades by lashing planks together. In another section, he mentions Indians. After dinner, we started in our boats in the hope of being able to make a few prisoners whom we might exchange for the two Indian Christians whom they held captive. And of course, he mentions Negroes and the Negro who had deserted. These people were all located in Mozambique on his first trip all the way to India. He hadn't even reached the area, but he found himself excited when he noticed that Indians had already landed in these places. It means that he is on the right path. But our story goes far back, far before Vasco da Gama. In fact, it's a story about how the Polynesians, or the Austronesians, made their way to Africa. And before that, where did they come from? In the case of Madagascar, they came from Indonesia, which is interesting because that is where our story will take us. But the original story starts in southern China, or what some people call Taiwan. Now, in Taiwan, it seems like the languages expanded from that one region, and of course, the boats and technologies that came with it, and they spread all the way to Madagascar and the Americas. They first reached Madagascar, and we don't even know how far back it was. It could be 2000 BC, or it could be somewhere in 100 AD. Whatever it is, they got there very quickly, showing that they had great interests and great travel. But that's not where it stopped. When they got to Madagascar, they fused with the population that was there, but there's supposed to be nobody in Madagascar. It turns out that there actually were people in Madagascar, and they were the Bantus. This shows us the evidence that the people in Bantu regions had already reached and crossed with boats all the way to Madagascar. Is it possible that the reason why this happened was because of a greater trade that they experienced or saw prior to this date? Some things make it seem like it's so. If you compare gamelan music or music from Southeast Asia and you compare marimbas and other musical instruments and other things that they traded before that, or at least alleged to have similarities, it could seem like the pull was not a coincidence. It was not just storms pushing them, but instead it was an understanding of a type of trade that came before. In Africa, there seems to be a direct route from the rock gong to the marimbas. In Southeast Asia, they seem to come out of nowhere. And for this, there is speculation that they might have come from this. If this was the thing that drew them closer to Madagascar, then why did they stop there? Why did they go only through the islands and not necessarily land and overwhelm the populations on the shore of the mainland Africa? If the connection of music is too small for any of you, then listen to this connection. What about the banana? The wild banana plant is found or was found in Southeast Asia, and we know that it was tamed in Southeast Asia and made into the edible banana about 10,000 years ago. Now, this would be nothing, no information at all, had this banana not been available in Africa, but it was available in Africa. Was it available 100 AD, 200 AD? Nope. It seems like it was available 4000 BC. But how did it get there? How did the people of Africa, quote unquote sub Saharan Africa, how did they tame a plant that seems to come from Southeast Asia before it ever reaches any other place? It doesn't reach Arabia, it doesn't reach China, it doesn't reach any of these other places as quickly as it does Africa. This is confusing because the best estimates now are that it came from pre-Austronesian. So forget the people that I'm talking about who traveled on ships. It came from pre-Austronesian people who then somehow sent it to Bornu in the Indonesian regions, and then from that area they sent it to Madagascar. This is a guess because these people would have been pre the people that I'm talking about, the travel that I'm talking about. So it seems like there was some kind of communication or large scale communication, which would make sense if you consider all the other stuff which these two places have in common. But let's make it a little more confusing. The places that have the banana are West Africa, Central Africa, and from there they move into Southern Africa and other places. But the Khoisan didn't have bananas, they didn't grow bananas, and anybody like that. So the places or the people who you would expect to get it first don't have it. As we read, succulent and sweet, bananas make an ideal snack, but they can also tell us a lot about human civilization. Such is the case with a new archaeological discovery which indicates that Africans were harvesting the fruit as early as 4,500 years ago. If correct, these findings would radically alter current assumptions about when agriculture came to the continent. For people living in the tropics, bananas can be vital to daily survival. This is particularly true in Africa, which has a very few native domesticable plants. Indeed, banana cultivation was the economic backbone of some African kingdoms that thrived before European colonization. Until recently, most African scholars assumed that the banana, which is native to New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, was not introduced into Africa earlier than about 2,000 years ago. Now, work at an archaeological site in Uganda has challenged that assumption. A team consisting of Julius Jeju and Mbarara University in Uganda, Peter Robertshaw of California State University, San Bernardino, and David Taylor of Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, analyzed sediment samples from the site of Munsa, about 125 kilometers northwest of Kampala. Earlier excavations at Musa, led by Robert Shaw, had shown that the site was first occupied by large numbers of people by 1,000 years ago. Yet radiocarbon dating of the samples indicate occupation up to 4,500 years ago. Fossil plant fragments called phytoliths of the banana genus Musa are present in these earlier levels. The team reports this month in the Journal of Archaeological Science. The researchers say that this early date for the banana cultivation is consistent with the findings of another team working at the site at Ngang in southern Cameroon, which previously found evidence of the banana cultivation dating back 2,500 years ago, a finding that was controversial at the time, but which now they say seems much less so. Moreover, the researchers argue that recent work by an Australian team indicating that bananas were cultivated in New Guinea at least 6,500 years ago makes the early African dates all the more plausible. And genetic evidence from the studies suggests that the bananas were first introduced from New Guinea into Southeast Asia. From there, sea traders could have brought them to East Africa across the Indian Ocean. The results are now exciting, says David Schoenberg. Now, all of that is fine, but what does that mean? Well, that means that some people from Australian or the Oceania regions traveled in about 2000 BC or even further, maybe 4000 BC, from Papua New Guinea to Indonesia and all the way to Africa, way before the date we thought, and possibly even shared their DNA. And maybe these people weren't as genetically infused with the Austronesians, and now there is no trace of them. It seems like they're the same as any other African. Maybe they brought the plant without any travel. The only other option is that somehow the banana was floating on the sea and the Africans just discovered it somehow, which is worlds of impossible. This also means that while the ancient Egyptians were constructing their pyramids, the Africans in sub Saharan Africa, as it's called by some people, were having direct contact with the Austronesian areas. Other similarities between these places, which have not been mentioned by a lot of papers, and I first dismissed it as coincidence, are the drawings that they do using a system called the bouncy ball algorithm. I dismissed this earlier because I did not know there was a true path between Africa and Australasia. But if there is no need to dismiss it. These drawings that are being shown here are sand drawings from Vanuatu. What's interesting about them is how they're drawn. As you can see, he's following a pattern. This pattern is to reach a corner and turn. As soon as you reach a corner, you turn. This mimics the sand drawings from Africa. And the way you draw these sand drawings is the same. When you reach the peak, you turn and you follow this 45-degree path, and then you turn again, and you do that over and over again until the drawing reveals itself. It means that you do not need to have the shape in your head, it will just reveal itself to you. So, the one with the hand in it is from Vanuatu. Vanuatu is in Oceania, it's nowhere near Africa. And the one which is digitally made is from Africa. And you can see the similarities just by looking. As far as back migrations back to Africa are concerned, this is probably the most impressive one. If these symbols represent anything of a similarity in history and not just a coincidence, then they will heighten the problem. Because at least with the banana, you can talk about trade that somehow made it there. But with this, you have to teach this somehow, and that would not be simply trade. So what's the problem then? So the people landed there. Well, we don't find African languages that much in the oceanic regions, and we don't find oceanic languages in Africa outside of Madagascar and a few islands. So, did they ever communicate? By the way, when I say we don't find any, I mean not even a word. The Bantu language seems to have nothing to do with the oceanic languages at all. But remember again, somehow through the Indian Ocean, they traveled to Africa, bringing the banana with them. In my opinion, this is the world's greatest open secret. The fact that people could do something like this and it cannot be talked about by any historical, anyone with even a slight taste of integrity would put this out there and say, this is the most important story that we do not tell about the history of our world. So, how late was this movement from the Austronesian regions all the way to Africa? Well, the earliest dates is about 3000 BC. Now, if you know about Egypt, you know that this is about when most archaeologists agree that the ancient Egyptians were beginning. But this changes everything. Because remember, the story is that Mesopotamia is the start of civilization. Well, how can it be when we already have people who are seafaring going back probably 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, and 4,000, 5,000 BC, and then 4,000, 5,000 years ago with the Austronesians. And then, of course, you have the other people. Like, in order for this to be true, you have to have such a narrow view of what civilization is. Now, you would think that things being that complicated would start to soften as time goes on, but actually it gets more complicated. We have less evidence and more evidence at the same time that there was communication. So first, things to confuse us is boats drawn by native Australians showing Indonesian boats. So we read archaeologists identify Malaccan boat on NT rock art drawing. Archaeologists at Flinders University have identified rare images of Malaccan vessels from Indonesian eastern island in rock art paintings that may provide the first archaeological evidence of visitors from Southeast Asia from somewhere other than Makassar or Sulawesi. The rock art offers new evidence of elusive and previously unrecorded encounters between indigenous people from Awan Barna, Arnhem Land, and visitors from the Moluccas to the north of Australia, according to the research. Now, of course, the African trade was not their strongest trade, even though you could argue that since they went so far to try and trade with these Africans, it would be the strongest, really. But I'm not arguing that. I'm saying that it was a small trade compared to their near societies like India and China. In fact, we know this because the empires that would come out of Indonesia were Hindu and Buddhist at first. And they had fights and they had all kinds of things that empires have, which we will discuss in detail another time. But then after that, they became Muslim. You can't really become Muslim without Muslims entering your region, and yes, they did come and take over. The first kings, which are recorded in writing, were from India, and well, we know that the Indonesians invented their own writing systems, And so we have evidence of people and where they came from and how they came. We even have seals and all kinds of stuff from China, which talk about the trade between Indonesia and China. And probably the most important thing that happened at one time was Kublai Khan sending an army down to Indonesia before he got defeated and sent packing. But all of that will have to be in a different video because this one is already quite long.